Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. We're dealing with, I think, a pretty important subject, and that is ministering to millennials. How do we as a church embrace millennials? How do we minister to them and preach the gospel and minister the gospel in such a way that it's engaging and transformative? And we'll be spending some time first looking broadly at the picture of millennials in our culture in general. What defines and characterizes this particular age group? And then I want to focus in specifically on the group of millennials that are at Sunny Slope Christian Reformed Church. How do we as a church and our church leaders and elders and deacons and pastor, how do we engage them in a way? What do we need to do as a church to do that? And then we'll look a little more broadly, not just at specific ways we can do that, but I think that will have application not just to those in our congregation, but to the broader culture as well. So this, I think, has broad application to many different churches in many different settings, because much of what we say about this age group will apply very broadly. I mean, how do we understand who they are? What makes a millennial a millennial? That will apply everywhere, and then we'll focus in a little bit more specifically. So just defining our terms, first of all, who are the millennials? Very simply put, they're those who are born between the years 1980 and 1995. Social scientists will differ a little bit from year to year, but in general that's about the age, give or take a couple of years. And so that means that the millennials today are those who are in the age group of about 18 to 35 years old. Other names, sometimes you hear them going by the emerging generation, sometimes they're called Generation Y, sometimes a little more disparagingly, Generation We. I think it was Time magazine just a couple weeks ago that did a cover story on this generation and portrayed them, in part the article was a humor piece, I think, but also it was an effort to characterize this group, and backlash came out after that because it portrayed this group, this generation, as very me-centered, very self-centered, and I think that's fairly simplistic. I think there's more than just this idea that they're a bunch of self-centered people. I don't think that's a fair characterization. Hopefully we'll see that as we go through. What defines a millennial? Well, obviously we've got to look at some of the events that happened during the lifespan, during the time that millennials really came of age. And I've singled out here some of the events, some of the things that took place. These are not just major news stories, but understand these as events that shaped a generation. And we'll go through them, just look at these as they come up, and then I'll talk briefly about each of these. Some of these events are obviously more significant than others, but each of them, I think, had a shape on the thinking and the values, the things that matter to this group. The first one that comes up is the Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton scandal. This redefined the meaning, I think, of sexual values and sexuality for a generation of people. The Daily Herald here at the top calls it a senseless rampage. That was the Columbine massacre. That happened in 1990, I believe it was 1999, in April of 1999. And that was the first in a long series, very unfortunate long series of violent school shootings. And unfortunately that's been a trend that continues today. And there are a whole lot of reasons that social scientists give for why that happened and the cause, the underlying social problems that lead to this, everything from gun rights and the place of gun ownership to the structure of the family that seems to be changing and collapsing and falling apart. A whole lot of things, but the point is that was the first event, and that's been a major issue that has been ongoing for this generation. 9/11 obviously was a huge thing. Not only was it, it was, for our country, everyone was impacted by this, but the millennials were, the oldest they were at that time was about 21, anywhere from 21 down to 6 or 7 years old, and so they came of age while the 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror was being fought, and so this was a major event that shaped thinking on everything from global, not economics, but global affairs and global relationships, terrorism, what that means. There was an aura of suspicion that really developed between, towards Muslims, feelings of being afraid even in the homeland, and then the following war in Iraq, which stirred up a lot of feelings of anger sometimes and patriotism and a whole lot of different things that came out of that. President Obama is elected. Of course, this is now much later, but it was a significant event in that many point to it, of course, as a milestone in overcoming racism, that an African American is able to be elected president. And that, I think, shows millennials, again, embrace that. They value that for reasons as we'll get into a little bit later on. Some of the other things that took place, again, these aren't, by the way, these aren't chronological. I'm just pointing to these, what I think are events of significance. Y2K, probably not a hugely culture-changing thing, but I think it was significant. I mean, the turning of the calendar from the 1900s to the 2000s, that's a whole millennium changing, and for some, as that happened, the fear of what would happen next, would the world survive, or would everything just fall into chaos? You can look at these two related together here. This one at the top, 60,000 jobs lost in a single day, and layoffs. Of course, that's pointing to the economic recession. We call it the Great Recession, which began in 2008. That had implications for millennials who were graduating college around that time, beginning to look for work, beginning to look for employment, and not able to find the jobs that they needed, and so they were forced to either take jobs that were significantly below their pay grade, or they were forced to find other ways to bring in an income, and there are other implications, as we'll see as we get on. Related to that, Occupy Wall Street, which is I think what happened in 2011, which began in 2011. That was a social response to what was perceived as the deeper problems in our society. Greed, corporate greed, and economic injustice, and all the problems of Occupy Wall Street. It was a movement that spread rather briefly, I think, around the world, but it raised these social concerns, and it was an expression of frustration and anger towards what was perceived to be injustices and inequalities in society, and that was something that really played a big part in the millennial generation. Millennials, that age group, was heavily involved in that. That reflects their concern for social problems and their desire to do something about it. And then finally, this is a more recent headline, the banner day for gay rights, the legalization, the move towards legalization of gay marriage and gay rights, which began really about 10 years ago and has been slowly developing over throughout the United States. And that has big implications because obviously gay rights are an issue that are of great concern, not just for our society in general, but younger people. They take this issue very seriously. And how the church reacts in response to this is going to be very important in terms of when we look at how millennials are ready and able to embrace faith. And so this whole idea of gay rights and the movement towards acceptance of gay marriage and that sort of thing. These are the events that defined a generation. Let's look at some of the trends, some of the things that have been taking place over the last really 20 years or so that have really shaped this generation. Again, this is not one thing you can point to, one specific event, but these are things that have been taking place in the culture as a whole. Obviously, the computer is a big one. The computer used to be a fairly bulky tool that was used for primarily playing very, very simple video games and doing very basic word processing. And over time, it's developed from this clunky thing to something that you could hold in your hand and is used for everything from buying pretty much everything that a person could imagine. It's used for getting directions. It's used for email communication, pictures. Just about everything is done by computer now. And not only that, but computers have become very portable. People hold them in their pockets, right? Your iPhone is something that you just take with you in your left pocket. And millennials, of course, many of them carry their iPhones with them. They're a huge part. These things are a huge part of their way of living. Many of them can't imagine. I mean, I've talked to youth group leaders who say, you know what, I don't know what to do. I can't pull them away from their iPhone. They just never stop texting. They never stop checking their Facebook and their email, that kind of thing. So the advent of the computer is a tool that is just such an integrated part of life today. The internet, here you've got the card catalog. Remember, if you wanted information back 25 years ago, you'd go to the library and you'd look it up in one of these card catalog thingies. Now, the internet has become, I mean, we can't imagine life without that either. That's changed the way we get information and really the way that we live our lives. I mean, if you want to know something now, if you want to know anything, you can get that information in a matter of seconds by typing it into a computer. And you get it instantly. Everything, I mean, think how much stuff you purchase online. Think of the way that you use the internet for getting directions, to looking up recipes, to staying connected with people. All these things, the internet has completely revolutionized our way of living. And the millennials really, they have grown up with the internet. It's become a huge part of their way of living. Related to the internet, of course, social media. Social media is huge. Everything from Facebook, which allows you to stay connected with your so-called friends, sharing pictures, sharing stories, sharing notes and thoughts about life in general. Everything from humorous lines. It's really remarkable. I hear some people from older generations kind of looking down on the use of Facebook because they say, look, you're always connected to that, and it's so useless. It's such a time waster. And of course, I mean, there's some truth to that, but on the other hand, the internet has allowed people, or Facebook has allowed people to stay connected with people all around the globe, and to be able to just keep in touch with things that are going on in everyday life, which isn't entirely a bad thing either. Related to that, blogging. Blogging is a tool that has really taken off probably in the last 10 years that allows anybody to share their thoughts and opinions about just about any subject imaginable, everything from politics to art to religion to day-to-day life. It allows us to keep connected with other people. YouTube obviously started out as something that was sharing silly cat videos and really pointless stuff, but now it's become a huge part of it. I mean, it's major because it gives you access to news and information that you otherwise wouldn't be able to gain. I mean, when there's breaking news, it's almost instantly something is put up on YouTube. So YouTube, and this video itself is being shared over YouTube. It's a medium to communicate with people that is used heavily by millennials. Twitter is another thing. Twitter is a tool that allows people to be connected in very short and pithy sentences. And you may think, well, that's really not a big part of our culture today. But actually, here's an example. Just today, just this morning, the new Prince of England was born to was it Prince William and Princess Kate, or the Duchess of whatever her name is, anyways. But the point is, the baby was born, and in old generations, in old days, the way that was announced was a proclamation went out from the hospital by police escort to Buckingham Palace, and then it was posted there in the palace courtyard. That didn't happen today. The way that the news was first broadcast was by Twitter. It went out on Twitter first, believe it or not. So this whole idea of being able to be socially engaged and socially connected, being able to get information and to transmit information instantly is just assumed by the millennial generation. Let's see if we can distill some of this down, and what I want to do is just focus this a little bit more carefully on what kinds of observations now can we make about this generation in general. What defines them? Who are they? What are some of their traits? Socially conscious, as I've already kind of hinted at, the millennial generation, and by the way, these are not in any particular order. These are just there are no orders, so don't necessarily assign priority to any one of them, but they are socially conscious. Millennials express a great deal of concern over social problems, poverty, racism, social inequality in terms of, as we've already said, the rights and place of homosexuals in culture, gay rights, in other social concerns, and the environment is a big one. These things matter hugely to the millennial generation. However, interestingly, many of the millennial generation, they feel like they lack the resources, they lack either the time or the money to actually make a difference, to really make a dent in the problems that they see. The millennial generation, in many ways, they see what's going wrong in society, but they feel like they can't actually do anything about it. They're too insignificant. They're just one person. And that can lead to them feeling rather cynical. Sometimes we look at millennials and they're characterized as being a sort of apathetic generation. I don't think that's entirely fair. I think if you look a little deeper, what you find is a frustration in the sense that I'm just one person and I can't fix it. And that can lead to cynicism, but it's not fair to just come out with broad and simplistic statements. Second one, and by the way, these statements and these descriptions in part come from, in large part, come from a research study that was done by the Pew Foundation on religion and public life. It was published about 3 years ago on millennials and religion. And then it was out of that also came a book called Souls in Transition that was that reflected that research. So that's where a lot of this comes from. A second quality that here to know, relationships matter. I mean, we've already seen that in the way that Facebook and Twitter and social media is so hugely important, right? Relationships are a big, big part of millennials, their lifestyle. They thrive on being connected. They thrive on being able to interact with other people. They desire relationships that are beyond, and this is ironic, I think, because Facebook and Twitter are, in one way, they can be so surfacey. They can just, exchanging very shallow comments and observations. And so you could look at that and say, look, millennials don't really care about real, deep, authentic relationships, but actually just the opposite is true. If anything, Facebook tells us that millennials are looking for and deeply yearning for deep connection and deep community. They want friendships, they want relationships that go below the surface, and actually where you're able to share life in common with other people. Millennials want to be able to open up to others and be able to share their hurts and their pains. And there is a lot of hurt and pain in this generation. They're looking for other people to share those concerns with. So relationships matter, hugely, hugely important. Along with that comes this whole idea that relationships are not as clearly defined anymore. And by that I mean that it used to be fairly assumed that, a generation or two ago, it'd be assumed that, you meet someone, boy meets girl, right, and they start dating, they fall in love, they get married. That happens still, but it's also changed. There's also a lot more exceptions to that. We find people that just, many people decide to live together before getting married, and maybe without even the intention of ever getting married. Terms like hooking up or friends with benefits give this idea that, look, two people can meet and they can have sex, and they'll just tell themselves that it doesn't really mean anything. It's just, it's just for our physical enjoyment, and it's in theory at least, it's understood that this is not a long-term commitment. This isn't a deep relationship. This is just meant for momentary enjoyment. And I relate that a little bit. I want to be careful not to overstate the connection. But I said a few slides back that the Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton thing really redefined and began to redefine what sexuality and what sex really is. And we see that here as well. Hooking up is fairly common, and it's actually a cause for concern, especially among the younger edge of the millennial generation. So, what else? This is a generation in transition. In part, this comes out of the economic troubles of 2008. This was a big factor because jobs became very scarce. People were this generation was beginning to graduate college and look for work, and it wasn't found. And so, in part, that led to many people having to postpone getting their job or getting into their career or changing careers, later on after they'd already graduated, going back to school, delaying getting married, delaying having a family. All those things were put off. An earlier generation would have started these things at a much younger age, and we're finding that the millennial generation isn't doing this till later. Purchasing a home with the housing crisis and everything else. Buying a home, these sorts of things that often are seen as going along with adulthood, they were being pushed off. They weren't happening until an older age. And we'll see a little bit more. I want to make another comment about that a little bit in just a few moments, but I want to just point that out. What about millennials and faith? What about the intersection and the place of spirituality and Christianity and religion and all this? That's kind of where we're headed. So we're going to focus now. We've looked broader. We're going to start to narrow in our focus and look at faith. many people look at the millennial generation and are very skeptical about their whether or not they embrace or are spiritual, or whether they're religious, whether they embrace their religious traditions. Many people think, well, this is a generation that is getting, fewer and fewer of them are religious, and many people would even, I think, say that very few millennials are actually interested in religion at all. That actually turns out to be completely false. Now, there are things to be concerned about, actually, and actually a lot of things to be concerned about when it comes to faith and religion, but and millennials, but it's never as clear-cut as being able to just say, look, this is a generation that doesn't care about religion at all. In fact, a majority of millennials do believe in God. A majority of religions, although a very small majority of millennials are affiliated with a Christian faith. A majority of millennials do believe in heaven, hell, angels, demons, and miracles. Now think about that a moment. Think of the significance of that. A majority of these people that we are dealing with, these young men and women, are, we say, spiritual. They do have a belief in God. I think it's significant that a majority of them, a large number of them, believe in heaven, hell, angels, and demons. In other words, they believe in the supernatural. If you were to go a generation back, this would have been a stumbling block for an earlier generation. This was something that, the whole idea of, because rationalism was so strong, and if, you need to be able to prove it logically, and if you can't, then I'm not going to believe it. That was a mindset of a generation or so ago. So when it came to miracles, and when it came to talking about, can you believe in God? Can you believe in the resurrection? Many people of an earlier generation would have said no. And that would have been the sort of the fulcrum on which faith kind of hinged. That's not the case for millennials. Millennials actually have very little trouble believing in, again, this is we're making rather broad statements here, but in general, you will find that many millennials believe in supernatural things, angels, demons, heaven, hell. Many of them believe in all that. They'll, even believe in miracles. They may have a different understanding than you and I would as part of the Christian tradition and the Christian faith, but they will still say, if you ask them, do you believe in heaven and hell? Yes, they do. However, here's where the sticking point is. If a previous generation would easily get stuck on the existence of miracles or heaven and hell and angels and all those sorts of things that supernatural things, the sticking point for this generation is this point here. Less than a third believe that their faith is the only way. In other words, it's the idea that Christianity, or their denominational or Christian tradition, their view is the only way to God. If you make that claim, very few people, very few millennials will actually buy into that. Say it another way, many millennials believe that there are many ways to get to God, there are many paths, many equally valid religions. Now, before you sort of jump to the conclusion that this is the problem of millennials, this is even more true of other generations, of even older generations, strange as that might seem. So this is a broad cultural problem, but it is very pervasive among millennials as well. We graphed it out, and we can put these numbers on a graph, and what this graph tells us is this gives us the percentage of each generation that is not affiliated with church, I shouldn't say church, unaffiliated with religion in general. So this shows us the percentage of each generation who really has no connection to an organized form of religion. We see this here, the green line here, this is the greatest generation. Then we see the silent generation, boomers, Gen X, and then millennials. This tells us a couple of things, but the stars, by the way, can indicate to us where the people of each generation were at a comparable age. So this tells us a couple of things. Obviously, the number of millennials, the number of people unaffiliated with religion, with organized religion, is rising with each successive generation in general. There are a couple of little exceptions to that rule, but in general, it's a rising trend. So more and more people are becoming unaffiliated with religion. Say the other way around, fewer and fewer people are becoming affiliated with organized religion. And that holds true when we look at comparable ages. When, say, if you were able to go back in time and look at a boomer when they were, say, 21 years old, you have about 12, 13% of them were unaffiliated. If you were able to go back in time and find a 21-year-old Gen X person, You have a higher number, you're around 21%, and then around 23-24% for millennials. So you're seeing a trend that's rising, and we can bring this up on the screen or two. We'll make some summary. But anyway, just notice that it's a growing trend that is becoming unaffiliated with organized religion. However, the news isn't all that bad. I mean, it's concerning, but I mean, we've got to kind of make some qualifications here. If you look at people who believe in God, if you look at people who actually claim that they do believe there is a God, here's where maybe this is somewhat encouraging. Maybe that's maybe an overstatement. But take a look at this. Total population today of people who do believe in God, you're right around 71%, 70%, something like that. So that's the total population. Now, when you break that down by generation, you find that yes, fewer millennials do believe in God, but it's not as dramatic as you might be inclined to think. In other words, you've got just about 63% of millennials do believe in God. Okay, about 63%. Gen X is a little more, but not significantly more. I think they're right around 70%. Boomers are right around, maybe just higher, 72%, something like that. And then the silent generation is around 74, 75%, something like that. There's no data available for the greatest generation. So all that to say is that when you look at the big picture, you do see that it's not as dramatic a difference as possible. In other words, we can't fall into that doomsday trap of saying the millennials are less spiritual and less godly, far more so than every other generation. Every other generation believes in God, and the millennials not so. The data just doesn't support that, but it does nevertheless show a trend that we ought to be concerned about, and that's that over time, fewer and fewer millennials are believing in God and being affiliated with organized religion. And that's the first conclusion that we can draw from this then. Affiliation with organized religion is declining over the decades, and more members of the millennial generation than any previous generation when at comparable age have no connection with religious organization. So that's a concern. I mean, as Christians, as pastors, church leaders, I think we need to take that seriously and pay attention to that. However, millennials believe in God only slightly less than members of other generations. And so this suggests that maybe this generation doesn't value organized religion, but it's not dismissive towards spirituality in general. They do, in fact, actually maintain spiritual beliefs and spiritual practices. Even more significantly, when you look at those who claim affiliation with organized religion and with their faith tradition, the intensity of their adherence to that religion, to that tradition, is and the way that they practice it through things like prayer and Bible study and worship attendance, that's actually stronger than in previous generations. So those that are affiliated are showing a growing commitment to their faith. So that's I think there's sort of something to be encouraged about in all of this. It's not all a bleak picture here. So, what's the cause behind this? What are some of the other conclusions? Just two more things to say. Affiliation with organized religion is declining. I said earlier that one of the traits of this generation is that they're sort of in this delayed adulthood thing. They put off the things like getting married, buying a home, settling down, raising a family. Part of that may explain this trend of decreasing involvement with religion, and that's because the social studies social science shows that one of the triggers that really gets people to be plugged into church is when they do these things, when they end up, specifically when they start a family. That's one of the things that makes people say, hey, we've got to get a church home. And because that's being delayed and being put off, that may explain why this is not happening and why there's more people that are not real plugged in. So it's not all of it. I mean, there's still, there are other issues and other factors here, but that may explain part of it. And so maybe that's room for some qualified optimism that as this generation does settle down, and maybe it's a little later, maybe we'll see affiliation and involvement with church life grow. When it comes to the intersection of faith and life, and we'll say more about this later, so I'm only going to mention it briefly now. Here's some of the things millennials are especially sensitive to. Religious exclusivity, that your way is the only way to get to heaven or to have a relationship with God. any perception of intolerance towards any social group, whether it be ethnicity, cultural background, sexual orientation, gender, anything like that. Religion that has very little to say about issues in the public square is another big thing. Religion, or a way of theology that is disconnected from the public realm, is seen as something that is a real concern for the millennial generation. Let's focus a little more specifically here at Sunny Slope Church. This, in part, was to look at a group here at our local congregation. But I think you'll find that probably these observations, that they're taken from members of our church. We had them over. You can see, spent a Sunday afternoon with a great group of these millennials from our church. My wife and I, we spent just a wonderful time talking with them and dialoguing with them. And I think you'll find what they have to say applies very broadly, but it is, this data was taken specifically from Sunny Slope Church. Because I want to show them now why this matters to our congregation, and this will have specific implications, I think, for our leadership and for our council. So the rest of you watching this can kind of listen in, but I think it does apply specifically here. Sunny Slope is a congregation. We're in Salem, Oregon, and Salem, the city itself, is a city including the whole metro areas, around 300,000 people. We are a church that's located in one of the suburban neighborhoods of the city. We draw in people from a wide geographical background. Many come from far as 45 minutes away. Agricultural background. Predominantly Dutch ethnicity, but that's changing over time. But here's what, we could say a whole lot more about that, but let's focus on the millennials. We are a church of about 228 members and regular attendees. That's those who are members and those who've been attending for approximately 6 months or more. Maybe they haven't become members yet, but they're becoming a part of our congregation. About 228 people. If you break that down by age, 57 of those members are under the age of 18. Now, that you've got to recognize, some of those, that includes those who are real young kids at high school. Some of them are not, some maybe are in the first year of college or whatever. So, but still, 57 members under the age of 18. Here's the millennial group. 46 of them between the ages of 18 and 35. 46 of them. That's a large number. Especially percentage-wise, as we'll see in just a couple minutes. 17, and this is one of them that kind of surprises a lot of people. They're only about 17 between the ages of 36 and 50. Now, I got to say, I had to guess on the actual ages of some people, and so sometimes I had to err on the side of making someone maybe a little younger than they really were. But in general, I think this is a pretty accurate number. It's maybe plus or minus a small handful, but not by much. In general, you'll see the percentage breakdown about the same. There are 50 between the ages of 50 and 65, and then 58 over the age of 65. And if you break it down, here's what the percentages look like. This yellow one here is the millennial group, the 18 to 35 group that we've been focusing on. You can see it's a large percentage of our church population. Here's the under 18 crowd, 65 and up, 50 to 65, and then there's that smaller group of 36 to 50. But more than that, what I think we need to look at is the trend that we see here. If you look at the number of members who've joined Sunny Slope Church in the last 5 years or so, we've had about 42 people who have joined, approximately. That does include those who were born into our church as well. 23 of those, however, are millennials. 23 of the population of Sunny Slope Church, 23 of the new people who've joined Sunny Slope Church are millennials. And that means that obviously this is a huge number, a huge percentage of people who are joining our church are in this age group. That means we got to pay attention to what makes this age group tick, to what makes them who they are, to the way that they think, to the way that they understand faith and religion and spirituality and Christianity and the gospel. This is a growing age group that we have the privilege of reaching out to, and so we've got to really take this very seriously. 8 of those who joined within the last, this is 8 of the millennials who joined within the last 5 years. They came from churches outside of the Reformed tradition, and they came to our church, to a Reformed tradition. And again, of the 42 millennials, 23 of the millennials, I guess the top list is 23 of the millennials associated with Sunny Slope either joined or returned within the last 5 years. In other words, if you count all the millennial people in our church, 23 of them, just over half, are they either came to or were re-affiliated with our church. As we were sitting down to lunch with them, we just had a great conversation. One of the things I asked them was just to talk about their experience with religion, Christianity, culture in general, just what were their perceptions. And I summarized them here. These aren't exact quotes of what people said, but they are pretty clear and pretty accurate summaries of what I heard from this group of about 20 people that we had over for lunch with them one day. One person said, look, for a while, they were away from our area. They were living in another part of the country for a while. And they said, there was a while we didn't attend church much because it didn't seem genuine. We felt, it seemed very phony. We were told all the rules that you had to live by. And then she says, you go to the local bar and you'd see someone in church leadership getting drunk. And so it just seemed a very phony sort of thing. They didn't live out what they believed. It was just kind of a surfacey kind of thing. That gets, again, it starts to hint at that idea of the importance of authenticity and something that is genuine. Again, another person says here, this was actually a couple people kind of conflating a couple of statements here that grew up in the same community, not too far from where we are in Salem, Oregon. They talked about growing up in a home and in a church that was all about the rules. Again, the church taught, here's the specific rules that define Christianity. One of them was about Sunday observance, and they said that, if you've got to go to church twice on Sunday. That was high on the list, and that was a criteria that was used to judge other people. And they have this little saying that I kind of thought was funny in a sad sort of way. They said, we were warned, oncers become noncers. In other words, if you only go to church once on a Sunday, it's not long and you're not going at all. And so there was this pressure to keep up the rules and to keep following the rules. Many of the relationships felt very surfacey. There was a pressure to appear like you had your whole life together on the outside, to appear that your family was intact, your marriage was perfect, your lifestyle was just all pristine and pure on the outside. And that meant that people who were struggling had to really hide things. And the millennial generation growing up in this sort of environment eventually kind of realized that there's something wrong. If you can't share your problems and the pain in your life and the issues that you're facing, something isn't quite right in religion, in life. And so millennials, I think, then are sensitive to the need to become authentic and genuine, as we'll see in just a couple minutes. I asked them a question. I said, so what are some of the barriers, or what are some of the things that might keep you from embracing the gospel? What are some of the things that might keep people in your generation from what might make them hesitant about buying into to Christianity? And here are a couple of things that they said almost right away. First was the church's view on homosexuality and sexual ethics. And they talked about how the church is often seen as a very negative voice in these areas, always criticizing, always condemning, always finding fault, and particularly in the area of gay marriage. Now, whether that's actually accurate or whether it's a perception, it doesn't seem to matter. The perception is that the church is all about enforcing the rules, whether it's gay marriage or whether it's couples that are living together, those who... And if Christians and if the church is perceived as antagonistic, they will lose a hearing, right? So if the church is just seen as, hey, we've got to enforce and impose an ethic on you, that's going to be a huge barrier to embracing and to even getting a hearing with someone. Hypocrisy and artificial faith. I talked a little bit about that, how millennials who had grown up in this home, in this environment where religion was treated as a set of rules that were imposed and preached but not practiced, and it's not it's not something that was changed from deep within. That was a real barrier because millennials learned to be suspicious of that. If they learned to see through these artificial sorts of displays of religion and outward patterns of behavior, they become, many of them express, not many, but some of them that we talked to expressed real hurt at the way they were treated by others. They felt judged, they felt condemned by members of the church who were really seen as hypocritical. They were pointing the finger at others, but they weren't living up to their own standards. So another barrier that I did mention ago, I'll just say a little bit more about it now, and that's the whole idea of exclusivity. Christians who condemn all other religions out of hand or speak condescendingly towards members of other faith and other traditions. they will lose a hearing among with the gospel. So, obviously, and we'll talk about this too in a minute, but we have to be able to make our claims, but we have to be very careful in how we do that. If we simply say, look, Jesus is the only way, and everything else, you're all lost, and you become very arrogant and condescending about it, you will lose credibility among other people. That's particularly true here in Oregon. We're very sensitive to, people in Oregon are very spiritual, very open to spiritual things, but if you claim that Christianity is the only way, you've right away lost your audience. And so we have to find a way, and that's what we'll talk about in a minute, we have to find a way to do that in a way, and to be careful about how we talk about Jesus being the only way. I asked a question, just kind of getting more into to what matters among millennial people, and I said, look, if for five years from now, if you find that you had to change churches, what would you look for in a new church? What would matter to you? And they all said, immediately, kind of people popping up around the room, they started chiming in. They said, well, we want people who really care for each other. We want a community of people who are invested in the lives of other people. We want people who know one another. We want a place to fit in with our peers. They wanted genuine relationships. They wanted a church that would be accepting of other people. And they were talking and they were saying things like this, and as I was hearing that, I was thinking, it's interesting, not one person, and this wasn't meant as a criticism or condemning or anything, but it just was an observation that I made in my mind. I realized, and I asked them about this too, as I was thinking, I said, I noticed that you didn't emphasize or you didn't bring up anything about doctrinal or biblical foundations. I said, is that just not as important? Is it, where does that fall? Is that kind of a secondary thing? And here's what struck me, I think, is really important. One person said, no, that's not it at all. They said, we assume that must be in place. We assume that there has to be a framework and a foundation of solid, accurate biblical teaching. If we get into a church that doesn't teach biblical, or that's really doesn't handle scriptures well, and is really poor at studying the text, we wouldn't go there at all. So we assume that that's going to be in place, and then we look for the relationships. And so that just gets back to the idea, to the criticism that is sometimes heard, that, millennials don't care about solid biblical teaching. They don't care, they just want relationships. Turns out that, at least in our context, that's not true. They do value that. Another interesting little tidbit, this actually was very encouraging to me. I said, if you find yourself in 5 years from now, you move away and you've got to find a new church. I said, how many of you would it matter? How many of you would look for another Christian Reformed church? For how many of you would that matter? And I expected maybe half of them. To my surprise, it was everyone in the room was, this would be important. Our denomination would matter to us. Now, that's very encouraging to me. Denominational loyalty. Now, that may be bucking the trend. I suspect it probably is. But in our church, in our setting at least, denominational loyalty remains very, very important. How do we bridge the gospel? What are some of the ways that we can? What are some of the openings among the millennial generation that we can reach into? What are some of the ways we can engage this gospel, this generation, with the gospel in a way that is going to be winsome? Here are at least a couple of things that I'm going to suggest. This comes from listening to this group in our church. It comes from studying and piecing together some of the data as well. Here's the first thing: emphasize Jesus. Now, I want to be clear on what I mean by that. I don't just mean you reduce the Christianity, the Christian messages, what would Jesus do, or something simplistic like that. What I mean is we need to draw the contrast between a religion that just says, here's the rules that you need to keep, and here's how you've got to live. Churches that teach that way, they're viewed as in a way irrelevant. They're viewed as unnecessary because people learn the rules. In fact, one of the studies that I came across kind of summarized it this way. They said if church is just seen as a place where people come to learn the rules, then it's kind of like they feel they graduate out of it around 15, 16, 17 years old. They've learned how to play by the rules. By that point, they've kind of learned how to be nice and how to get along with other people, and so they see, look, church may be an okay thing, but I already know the rules and the morals that I need to play by, and so I don't need to come to church anymore. And so when I say emphasize Jesus, what I mean is that we've got to present Jesus as the one in whom who is worthy of our adoration and our obedience. In other words, present Jesus as someone who is to be adored. learn to show that Christianity is not about keeping rules, but it's about adoring our Savior who lived actually the perfect life that we could never live and died the death that we deserve. Right now, how you do that and how you actually communicate that, we'll get to that a little bit more in a moment, but I'm saying emphasize Jesus instead of the rules and the regulations, and then teach the ethics as a result of and as a response to what Jesus has done. Emphasize the importance of relationships. I've already talked at fairly great length so far that relationships matter to this generation. Relationships are very important. And we need to emphasize, this is not just a preaching thing, but this is more of a church ministry strategy. Preaching takes place, and gospel transformation, I think, takes place in the context of community. So the emphasis and the importance of the whole church living together and building a sense of community and care and concern and love for one another becomes immensely important for this generation. Right? Church cannot be a place where you just kind of come in and do your church thing, do your religious thing, bunch of unconnected people who come in and receive their service for the week and then kind of all leave in separate cars. Church has to be a place where there has to be a sense of community and depth that is palatable in the church. And then finally, address, and I emphasize carefully, address social issues. Because social issues matter, I mean, that goes back to the way that I talked about, Occupy Wall Street and this perceived injustice and the problems that are seen by this generation. They care about these kinds of things, and if the church doesn't have anything that engages these sorts of issues, the church is seen as irrelevant and unnecessary. And so yes, the church has to engage those things, but it has to do so carefully. People today are sensitive to this perception that the church is the religious wing of the Republican Party, right? That it's just an extension of, morals and values that flow from more of a political party. And so we have to find a way to engage social issues, but do it in a way that doesn't overstep the boundaries and the limits of authority in which the church can speak. So don't simply, the church can't just simply say, here's the right answers, here are the right rules in this situation and on this issue. No, the church has to engage these things, I think, in ways that are going to be constructive. How to do it? I put together this little chart that shows what we call a solid but flexible model of engagement. And all that means is that we're going to be presenting the gospel message in a way that holds to our core convictions and core principles of biblical teaching, but is also flexible enough to engage this audience and this group of people. So just a few suggestions here, just a few ways that we do this. And again, not in any, I don't think, particular order of importance or anything like that, but here's the first one. Articulate answers and objections to the Christian faith and defend the truth of the gospel. So in other words, just for example, when you come to that question of is Jesus the only way, you've got to be able to defend that. You've got to be able to answer that in a way that is faithful to Scripture, but the flexible side of this says you've got to learn to do it, and I say practice presuppositional apologetics. And what I mean by that is you're going to learn to affirm the other person's worldview. You're going to learn to enter into it and listen to what they're saying. Listen to their objections, listen to their concerns, and you're going to learn to even affirm what is strong about that. So you might say this person who says, look, Jesus is the only way, and you're trying to explain that. You're going to listen to someone who says, that can't be, that's intolerant, and so on. You're going to actually say, you know what, I can see why you'd make that case, and I think you want to have a God who's more loving. And then you learn to point out the weaknesses, and you say, but if God really just accepts anyone, how loving is that really? Right? And then you go on to point out that God who just accepts everyone regardless of how they've lived, or just that's not as loving as someone who has to actually die for the brokenness of the people. Now that's just an example, but I use that to show that we hold to those truths, but we do so in a way that rather that's combative, it's actually engaging with them. Speak to social concerns. We've talked about this already. Things like poverty, homosexuality, racial injustices, racial environmental concerns. But I say challenge both the traditional left and right-wing perspectives. And I don't mean, here's the weaknesses on both sides, let's meet somewhere in the middle. I mean, find a way to challenge both sides and then present the gospel worldview as a third alternative that's neither one nor the other, nor a mix of two, but actually it's a third way. It's something that's motivated by the gospel, the motif of God's creation, our fall, God's work of reconciliation and redemption, and His final consummation. Preach about sin. A lot of people say, look, millennials don't want to hear about sin. They're indifferent. If you preach about sin, that'll turn them right off. And I say that's not true, actually. Millennials can see plenty of evidence of sin. We looked at earlier at the events that have shaped this generation, everything from Columbine to 9/11 to many other things. There's plenty of evidence about sin. I don't think millennials have a real problem accepting the idea of sin. But here's something to think about. Show that sin is not just breaking the rules, right? Sin is not just being a quote-unquote bad person, but sin can also be being a good person, quote-unquote. Right? Show that sin is both rebellion against God, breaking the rules, and keeping the rules. In other words, challenge people to see that you can be in rebellion against God by being a very, very good person so that you don't think you need a Savior. Right? Challenge that perception of what sin really is all about. Call for repentance related to the idea of sin. Call people to Christ. I mean, don't just be bold about that. Engage people and invite them to salvation in Christ. But when you talk about repentance, you've got to show them that it doesn't just mean that you're embracing a new set of morals or a new set of new moral or ethical code, but actually what you're doing, you're entering into a relationship of love and surrender to a Savior who first loved you. And if you present it that way, that's maybe gives people a new way to think about it. Call for obedience. Again, you've got to call people to live according to how Scripture calls us to live. I think you can't get away from that. But how do you do it? You emphasize that, and I emphasize, I mean that you highlight this. You drive this point home because it's important. This is something that the millennial generation is somewhat visceral and has a visceral reaction to. Emphasize that godly living is a response to and not a means to God's love. Emphasize what obedience is, because I think many millennials misunderstand it. They've been taught, unintentionally perhaps, but they've been taught that obedience is a way to earn God's love and approval. Preach biblically and theologically meaty sermons, right? Millennials want stuff that's going to challenge their thinking, but they don't just want, they want doctrine, they want theology, I think. But you've got to show that it engages the whole person. It's not just information that fills our head, but it's actually stuff that actually changes our hearts and our lives as well. A couple of practical suggestions for how you can kind of drill this all down and do some practical things in your own church or your own ministry context and ministry setting. Number one, create a forum for dialogue on sermon material. So you might be after the sermon on Sunday morning, it might be a Wednesday night midweek group, whatever, it might be a Sunday school class even, where you're going to be engaging so that it doesn't cut